The storm began suddenly that night, the way all the important moments in my life seemed to begin, without warning, without time to prepare. One minute, the evening had been still, almost suffocating in its quiet, and the next, rain was hammering against the windows of my apartment like it was trying to break through. The thin glass rattled in its frames, those old wooden frames that had been painted over so many times you couldn't tell what color they'd started as anymore. I was sitting on the couch, knees drawn up, watching the water streak down the glass in rivers that caught the streetlight and turned gold before disappearing into darkness. There was something hypnotic about it, the way the rain transformed the familiar view into something abstract and unknowable. The buildings across the street had become watercolor suggestions of themselves, bleeding into the night. That's when Nolan dropped the blanket over us both. I hadn't heard him get up from the other end of the couch. I hadn't heard him walk to the closet where I kept the extra blankets, the ones my mother had sent when I first moved here, worried I'd freeze in this drafty place. But suddenly there was a wool settling over my shoulders, heavy and warm, and Nolan was sliding closer without asking, without announcing himself, just moving into my space the way he always did, like it belonged to him as much as it belonged to me. He pulled the blanket snug around both our shoulders, and I felt the couch dip as he settled in beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body through the thin cotton of his shirt, close enough that I could smell that particular mix of laundry detergent and something else, something that was just inherently him, like cedar and coffee and late nights. When I turned to look at him, confused by this sudden proximity, by this unexpected cocoon he'd created around us, Nolan only smiled. It wasn't his usual grin, the one that took over his whole face when he was telling a story or laughing at something ridiculous on his phone. This was something smaller, quieter, a smile that lived mostly in his eyes, in a slight lift at the corner of his mouth, a smile that seemed to hold words he wasn't saying, couldn't say, or maybe just wouldn't say. The storm raged outside, wind throwing rain against the windows in waves that sounded like the ocean I grew up near but hadn't seen in years. Thunder rolled somewhere distant, a low rumble that I felt more than heard, vibrating through the old bones of the building. But beneath the blanket, in this small space Nolan had carved out for us, everything was still. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with something I couldn't name, didn't want to name, was terrified to name. His shoulder pressed against mine, through the blanket, a point of contact that shouldn't have meant anything. We'd been friends for over a year. He practically lived here, showing up at odd hours with takeout or a six-pack, commandeering my couch for movie nights that sometimes turned into him crashing here when it got too late. We'd sat close before, shared spaces before, but this felt different. This felt intentional in a way that made my chest tight. I wanted to ask him what he was doing. I wanted to make a joke about personal space or the suddenness of the storm. I wanted to do something, anything, to break this moment before it became something we couldn't take back. But I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. All I could do was sit there, watching the rain distort the world outside, while feeling the solid warmth of him beside me, the weight of the blanket holding us both in place. The apartment felt smaller with him this close, but not in a claustrophobic way. It felt concentrated, like all the air had become something thicker, something that required conscious effort to pull into my lungs. The familiar became strange. The coffee table with its water rings and scratches, the bookshelf overflowing with paperbacks I'd collected from secondhand stores, the lamp in the corner casting its usual amber glow. Everything looked different viewed from inside the shared warmth. Nolan shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket where it had slipped from his shoulder, and his hand brushed mine in the process. It was nothing, just a brief touch, fingers against fingers for less than a second. But he didn't pull away as quickly as he should have. His hand lingered there in the space between us, not quite touching, but close enough that I could feel the possibility of it, the invitation of it. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof now too, surrounding us with sound. But all I could focus on was the quiet rhythm of Nolan's breathing beside me, the way it had slowed and deepened, like he was settling into something, deciding something, like he'd been carrying this moment with him, waiting for the right time to unfold it. I thought about all the times he'd been here before, sprawled on this same couch, talking about his day, or complaining about his roommate, or just existing in my space with an ease I'd never had with anyone else. I thought about how I'd started to measure my weeks by when I'd see him next, how the apartment felt too quiet when he wasn't here filling it with his presence. I thought about how dangerous this was, what was happening right now under this blanket in this storm. But I didn't move away. I couldn't. Or maybe I just didn't want to. The storm would pass, I knew. The rain would stop. The thunder would roll on to wake other people in other apartments. And tomorrow the sun would come back like none of this had happened. But right now, in this moment, with Nolan's smile still playing at the edges of my peripheral vision and the blanket holding us both in its warm embrace, I let myself believe that maybe some storms were meant to change things. Maybe some storms were meant to wash away the careful boundaries we'd built, leaving only what was true in their wake. That night under the blanket wasn't the beginning. Not really. The beginning was 13 months earlier when Nolan moved into the apartment next door for B to my 4C and knocked on my door 11 at night to ask if I had a corkscrew. I'd stood there in my threadbare college shirt and pajama pants, holding out the wine opener while he grinned at me like we were already friends, like he'd known me for years instead of seconds. By the end of that week, he was on my couch watching a movie I'd mentioned in passing. By the end of that month, he had his own coffee mug in my kitchen, a ridiculous thing with a cartoon cat that he brought over one morning and never took back. That was Nolan. He had a way of inserting himself into spaces, into lives, without anyone quite noticing it was happening until suddenly he was essential, like he'd always been there. My life before him had been carefully ordered, predictable. I was 22 in my final year of university, working evening shifts at a bookstore downtown to keep this small apartment that cost too much, but was mine. My days had a rhythm to them. Classes in the morning, studying in the afternoon, work or reading at night. The apartment reflected that order, everything in its place, books arranged by genre on shelves I'd built myself, a desk by the window where I wrote papers and watched the street below. The apartment itself was nothing special. One bedroom, a living room that bled into a kitchen barely big enough for two people to stand in, bathroom with tiles that had probably been white once, but had aged into something closer to cream. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor on the other side practicing violin at odd hours, and the radiator clanged like it was dying every time the heat kicked on. But it was mine, this small space on the fourth floor of a building that had seen better decades, and I'd made it feel like home with secondhand furniture and too many books and a few plants that somehow survived despite my neglect. Nolan was 23, though he seemed both older and younger than that, depending on the moment. He worked at a recording studio downtown, doing something with sound engineering that he tried to explain to me once while I nodded along, understanding maybe half of it. He was everything I wasn't, spontaneous where I was cautious, loud where I was quiet, comfortable in his skin in a way I'd never learned to be. He filled rooms just by entering them, drew people into his orbit without trying. But for some reason, he'd chosen my orbit to settle into. He started showing up at my door with takeout containers, saying he'd ordered too much, though I suspected he'd ordered for two from the beginning. He'd sprawl on my couch and tell me about the bands that came through the studio, doing impressions of pretentious lead singers that made me laugh until my sides hurt. He'd borrow books from my shelves and actually read them, coming back with thoughts and questions that turned into conversations that lasted until 2 in the morning. His own apartment was a mystery I'd only glimpsed a handful of times. Messy in a lived-in way, music equipment in corners, posters for bands I'd never heard of covering the walls. But he'd prefer my space, he said. It was quieter, calmer, better for thinking. Though what he needed to think about, he never said. We fell into patterns without discussing them. Tuesday movie nights. Weekend grocery runs where he'd throw things into my cart and insist on paying for half. Late evening walks when the air finally cooled down, wandering the neighborhood while he talked, and I listened, comfortable in a silence that never felt empty when he was there to fill it. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his expression different from his usual easy smile. Something more serious, more searching. But when I'd meet his eyes, he'd just grin and change the subject. make some joke that would dissolve the moment before it could solidify into something we'd have to acknowledge. I told myself we were friends. Good friends. The best friend I'd had since moving to the city for school, leaving behind the small coastal town where I'd grown up. I told myself that the way my day felt incomplete if I didn't see him was normal, that the way I'd started keeping his favorite beer in my fridge was just being considerate. I told myself that the flutter in my chest when he laughed at something I said was nothing, meant nothing, would lead to nothing. But there were moments when the careful architecture of that friendship felt fragile, when his hand would rest on my shoulder a beat too long, when he'd fall asleep on my couch and I'd watch him breathe in the lamplight, wondering what it would be like to smooth the hair back from his forehead, when he'd say my name, Silas, in that particular way he had, like it was a word he enjoyed the shape of in his mouth. Those moments lived in the spaces between what we were and what we weren't, in the silence beneath our easy conversation, in the distance between his apartment and mine that felt both too far and not far enough. We existed in that liminal space, that careful balance, until the night the storm came and he dropped the blanket over us both, smiling that quiet smile that changed everything. After that first night with the storm, I expected things to return to normal. I expected Nolan to pretend it hadn't happened, that moment of closeness under the blanket, the way he'd smiled at me like he was telling me a secret without words. I expected us to fall back into our safe patterns, our careful friendship with its unspoken boundaries. But Nolan had never been one for doing what I expected. The next Tuesday movie night, he arrived with Chinese food and that same easy grin like nothing had changed. We sat on the couch, containers spread on the coffee table, and I tried to focus on the screen. 20 minutes into the movie, without warning or ceremony, he stood and retrieved the blanket from where I'd folded it over the back of the couch. He shook it out and dropped it over both of us, settling into that same close position, shoulder to shoulder, the wool creating a shared space that felt separate from the rest of the room. He didn't ask if it was okay. He didn't explain or justify. He just did it, like it was his right, like this was what we did now. I could have said something. I could have shifted away, made a joke about him being cold-blooded, turned it into nothing. But I didn't. I sat there, pretending to watch the movie while every nerve in my body focused on the points where we touched shoulder, arm, sometimes knee when one of us shifted. The blanket became heavier with meaning each time he pulled it over us. It became our ritual, unspoken but consistent. Every time we sat together on that couch, whether for movies or just talking, Nolan would grab the blanket. Sometimes he'd already have it ready when I got home from work, draped over his shoulders like a cape, waiting for me to sit so he could extend it around me too. The gesture was always accompanied by that same small smile, the one that seemed to say things his words wouldn't. Under the blanket, everything felt different, concentrated. The air between us grew thick with something unnamed, something that made my pulse quicken and my thoughts scatter. We'd sit there ostensibly watching whatever was on the screen, but I was always hyper-aware of him, the rhythm of his breathing, the way he'd absently run his hand along the edge of the blanket, the warmth that radiated from him and made me want to lean closer. Sometimes our hands would brush beneath the fabric, accidental touches that felt anything but accidental. His fingers would graze mine when reaching for his beer, and instead of pulling away immediately, there'd be a moment of suspension, of contact that lasted a heartbeat too long. He never acknowledged these moments out loud, but I'd feel him still beside me, like he was holding his breath too. The silence under the blanket took on its own quality, different from our usual comfortable quiet. It was charged, expectant, like the air before a thunderstorm. We'd have entire conversations without speaking. In a way, he'd shift closer when a movie got intense. In a way, I'd let my head tilt toward his shoulder without quite touching. In a way, our breathing would sync up until we were inhaling and exhaling in the same rhythm. One evening, 3 weeks after that first storm, the power went out in the building. We sat in the darkness, the blanket around us, candles flickering on the coffee table. The silence stretched between us, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. He said, so quietly I almost missed it, that it felt better when you're not alone in it. I knew he meant the darkness, the power outage, the inconvenience of it all. But I also knew he meant something else, something larger. The words sat between us under the blanket, and I wanted to respond, wanted to tell him I understood, that I felt it too, this thing we weren't naming. But my throat closed around the words, and all I could do was nod in the darkness, hoping he could feel my agreement, even if he couldn't see it. The blanket started to smell like him, like us. That mix of his cologne and my laundry detergent, of shared meals and close quarters. I found myself looking forward to the weight of it, to the excuse it provided for closeness. On nights when he wasn't there, I'd sit with it wrapped around just me, and it felt wrong, incomplete, like trying to harmonize alone. He started staying later, leaving only when the clock pushed past midnight, and he had work in the morning. He'd stand reluctantly, letting the blanket fall from his shoulders, and there'd be a moment when we'd look at each other, when it seemed like one of us might say something about what was happening beneath that will shield. But the moment would pass, and he'd squeeze my shoulder and say goodnight, and I'd listen to his door close across the hall, wondering how much longer we could sustain this ritual without acknowledging what it meant. The storms kept coming that spring, unusual for the season, the weather as unsettled as everything between us. Each time the rain started, I'd think about that first night, about his smile in the darkness, about how a simple blanket had become the most dangerous and necessary thing in my carefully ordered world. The storm outside became less important than the storm inside me. That's what I remember most about those weeks, how the external weather ceased to matter, how rain or shine, calm or chaos. All that really registered was whether Nolan would be there when evening came, whether the blanket would drop over my shoulders like a question I was too afraid to answer. I started measuring time differently, not in hours or days, but in the moments between his arrival and departure. My apartment, which had once been my sanctuary of solitude, began to feel too large when he wasn't in it. The couch seemed to stretch endlessly when I sat there alone, the cushions holding the memory of his weight, the phantom warmth of where he should be. I catch myself listening for his footsteps in the hallway, learning to distinguish his particular rhythm from the other neighbors. Quick, but not rushed, confident, purposeful. I'd hear his key in his lock and hold my breath, wondering if he'd come over or stay in his own space. More often than not, within an hour, sometimes less, there'd be a knock on my door. Not because he needed anything anymore. We'd moved past the pretense of borrowed items or extra food. He knocked now, just to be let in, to exist in my space, to pull that blanket over us, and sit in that charged silence that was becoming harder to bear and impossible to give up. Nolan grew softer during those evenings under the blanket. The easy performer's energy that he carried through the world would settle into something quieter, more real. His laughter became less frequent, but more genuine, low chuckles that I felt through the points where our bodies touched. His words came slower, more considered, like he was weighing each one before letting it go. Sometimes he'd start to say something. I could feel the intake of breath, the preparation, but then he'd stop, let the air out slowly, and the unspoken words would join all the others floating in the space between us. His hand started finding mine beneath the blanket, not holding, not quite, but resting there, our fingers barely touching, a point of contact that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Sometimes his thumb would move, just slightly, brushing against my knuckle in a way that made my whole body aware of itself. These touches never lasted long. One of us would always pull away, reach for a drink, shift position, but they left marks on me that I could feel for hours after. One night, a Thursday that had no reason to be significant, we were watching something forgettable on the television when I felt him looking at me. Not at the screen, not at his phone, but at me. I turned to meet his eyes, and for once, he didn't look away, didn't smile to deflect. We stared at each other in the flickering light from the TV, the blanket around us like a world apart from everything else. I whispered, because anything louder would have shattered something, that he always did this. He asked what I meant, though I think he knew. I told him he acted like I was his without ever saying it. The words hung there between us, visible almost, taking shape in the dim light. I watched something shift in his expression, a vulnerability I'd never seen before breaking through that easy confidence. His hand found mine again under the blanket, and this time he held on, properly held on, our fingers interlacing like they'd been designed to fit that way. He didn't answer my observation, didn't confirm or deny. He just held my hand and pulled the blanket tighter around us with his free arm, creating an even smaller world, an even more dangerous space. We sat there, hands clasped hidden beneath the wool, watching the rest of the movie without seeing any of it. When it ended, he stayed. When the credits finished rolling and the screen went dark, he stayed. We sat in the darkness, holding on, neither of us willing to be the first to let go. That became part of the ritual too, the hand-holding that happened only under the blanket, only in that protected space we'd created. We never spoke about it, never acknowledged it in daylight or when the blanket wasn't there to shield us. It existed in that separate reality, both real and unreal, both everything and nothing. I started dreaming about him, dreams where the blanket dissolved and there was nothing between us but air and intention. I'd wake up disoriented, reaching for something that wasn't there, my apartment feeling wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Some mornings I'd see him in the hallway, heading to work, and he'd smile at me like nothing was happening, like we weren't slowly dismantling every boundary we'd built, like the careful architecture of our friendship wasn't collapsing one evening at a time. The storm inside me grew stronger with each passing day, a pressure building that I knew would have to break eventually. Every time he arrived at my door, every time the blanket settled over our shoulders, every time our hands found each other in that hidden space, I felt myself moving closer to something inevitable, something that would change everything or destroy everything, or maybe both. It came during the heaviest rain yet, a storm that felt biblical in its intensity, like the sky had been storing up water for months just to release it all at once. The weather reports had warned about it for days, but nothing quite prepared me for the violence of it when it arrived. Trees bent nearly horizontal outside my window, and the rain came in sheets so thick I couldn't see the building across the street. Nolan had come over early that evening, before the worst of it hit, carrying a flashlight and a bag of candles. He said the power would probably go, that buildings like ours always lost electricity in storms like this. He was right. Just after 9, everything went dark. The TV cutting off mid-sentence, the refrigerator's hum dying, the lamp in the corner disappearing like it had never existed. We sat there in the sudden darkness, both of us still for a moment, adjusting to the absence of light. Then I heard him moving, the scratch of matches, and one by one, candles began to bloom around the room. He placed them on the coffee table, the bookshelf, the windowsill, until we existed in a cave of flickering gold light that made everything look older, more essential, like we'd stepped outside of time. He returned to the couch, to his spot beside me, and pulled the blanket over us without hesitation. But this time felt different. Maybe it was the darkness beyond our small circle of light, or the way the storm made it feel like we were the only two people left in the world, or maybe it was just that we'd been building to this moment for weeks, months, maybe even since that first night he knocked on my door asking for a corkscrew. We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the storm rage, our hands finding each other beneath the blanket automatically now, fingers interlaced like it was the most natural thing in the world. The candlelight threw shadows on his face that made him look like a stranger and exactly himself at the same time. I could feel something building in the space between us, a pressure that matched the storm outside. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. The weight of all those unspoken words, all those moments of almost all those careful boundaries we'd been pretending still existed. I asked him, my voice barely louder than the rain, why he kept smiling like that. Like he knew something I didn't. Like he was waiting for something. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. His thumb moved against my hand, a slow, deliberate motion that felt like he was gathering courage from the contact. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying a weight that made my chest tight. He said, "Because I've wanted this for longer than you think." The words landed between us like something physical, something that changed the shape of the air. I turned to look at him fully, and, in the candlelight, his expression was completely open for the first time since I'd known him. No easy smile to deflect, no joke to dissolve the tension. Just Nolan, looking at me like I was something he'd been afraid to want but couldn't help wanting anyway. He continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam had broken. He told me he'd been watching me through his window that first week after he moved in, trying to work up the courage to introduce himself. That the corkscrew had been an excuse. He'd had one all along. He told me about all the times he'd wanted to say something, to cross that line we'd drawn, but he'd been terrified of ruining what we had. He said he tried to be satisfied with friendship, with movie nights and shared dinners and sitting close on the couch, but every day it got harder to pretend that was enough. The blanket, he said, had been his compromise, a way to be close to me without having to risk saying what he really wanted, a way to exist in that space between friendship and something more without having to choose. But he was tired of pretending, tired of smiling when he wanted to do something else entirely, tired of leaving my apartment every night when all he wanted was to stay. I sat there, his words washing over me like the rain outside, each confession restructuring everything I thought I knew about us. All those moments I'd dismissed as my imagination, all those looks I'd told myself meant nothing, all those touches I'd convinced myself were accidental. None of it had been what I'd told myself. It had all been real, all been intentional, all been Nolan trying to tell me without words what he was finally saying now. The storm seemed to pause, or maybe I just couldn't hear it anymore over the sound of my own heartbeat. Nolan's hand tightened around mine, and I realized he was trembling slightly, this person who always seemed so sure of himself shaking as he waited for me to respond to his confession. For the first time, I understood that the blanket had never been just about warmth. It had been about creating a space where we could be ourselves, where we could stop pretending, where we could acknowledge what had been building between us since that first night. It had been Nolan's way of saying everything he'd just said, night after night, hoping I'd eventually understand. The storm outside raged harder, wind rattling the windows like it wanted to be let in, to witness what was happening in this small circle of candlelight. But the real storm was here between us, in the space where Nolan's confession still hung, waiting for me to do something with it, waiting for me to either catch it or let it fall. I could feel him starting to pull back, his hand loosening in mine, that old defensive smile beginning to form at the edges of his mouth like he was preparing to turn his vulnerability into a joke, to give me an out, to pretend he hadn't just torn down every wall between us. I couldn't let him do that. Not after everything. Not when he'd finally said what I'd been too terrified to even think, let alone voice. I turned on the couch, pulling my hand from his only to reach for his face, to hold him there, to stop him from retreating into that easy deflection that had kept us safe and separate for so long. My voice came out rougher than I intended, thick with all my own unspoken confessions, when I told him to stop hiding behind smile. His eyes widened, those eyes that I'd memorized without meaning to, that shifted from brown to amber in the right light. They were now reflecting the flickering candles like they held fire inside them. I watched him process my words, watched understanding dawn across his features, watched hope replace the fear that had been there moments before. The rain hammered against the windows, a percussion that seemed to match my racing pulse. Nolan's eyes searched mine, looking for something, permission, maybe, or certainty, or just the courage to close the distance that still remained between us. His gaze dropped to my mouth, then back to my eyes, a question in the movement. I could have said something more, could have confessed my own months of wanting, could have told him about all the times I'd watched him leave and wanted to call him back, could have admitted that I'd been falling for him since that first night with the corkscrew and the grin that suggested we were already inevitable. But words felt inadequate, too small for what was happening between us. Instead, I leaned forward, closing half the distance, and waited. It had to be his choice too, this moment that would change everything. The blanket slipped from my shoulders, but I barely noticed. All that mattered was the way Nolan's breath caught, the way his hand came up to mirror mine, fingers trembling against my jaw, the way he whispered my name like a prayer or a promise. Then he was moving, closing those final inches with a certainty that made my chest ache. The first touch of his lips was hesitant, barely there, like he was still afraid I might pull away, might change my mind, might remember all the reasons this was dangerous. But I pressed closer, my hand sliding from his face to the back of his neck, holding him there, telling him without words that this was what I wanted, what I'd wanted for longer than I'd let myself acknowledge. The kiss deepened, all those months of careful distance collapsing into this single point of contact. He kissed like he did everything else, with intention, with presence, with his whole self. His hand tangled in my hair, and I could taste the coffee he'd been drinking earlier, could feel the slight roughness of his jaw, could sense the tremor that ran through him that matched my own. The storm outside seemed to crescendo, thunder cracking directly overhead, but felt distant, unimportant, like something happening in another world. Our world had shrunk to this, to his mouth on mine, to the way he made a soft sound when I pulled him closer, to the heat that spread through me like I'd been cold for months without knowing it. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the blanket had fallen completely, pooled on the floor at our feet. Neither of us reached for it. We didn't need it anymore. The barrier it had provided, the excuse for closeness, the shield that had let us pretend, none of that was necessary now. The warmth between us came from something else entirely, something that had been building since that first night, but that we'd been too careful, too afraid to acknowledge. Nolan's forehead rested against mine, and I could feel him smiling. Not the deflective smile or the knowing smile, but something new, something unguarded and genuine and meant just for me. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, a touch so gentle it made my chest tight. He said my name again, Silas, like he was testing how it felt now that everything had changed. The candles flickered around us, casting dancing shadows on the walls, making the familiar space of my apartment feel transformed, like we'd crossed into somewhere new. The storm continued outside, rain and wind creating a symphony of chaos, but inside this small space, in this moment suspended between our old life and whatever came next, there was a perfect, fragile peace. We stayed there, forehead to forehead, hands holding faces, breathing each other's air, letting the magnitude of what had just happened settle around us like the blanket we no longer needed. Weeks later, the storms kept coming. That spring seemed determined to wash the city clean, or maybe drown it trying. But I barely noticed the weather anymore, except as a kind of background music to this new thing we'd become, Nolan and I, this thing that didn't have a name yet but didn't need one. The morning after that night, after the confession and the kiss and the way everything shifted, I'd woken up on the couch with Nolan's arms around me, both of us having fallen asleep, sitting up, leaning into each other like we'd been doing it for years. The candles had burned themselves out, leaving waxy puddles on every surface, and weak sunlight was filtering through the rain-streaked windows. He'd opened his eyes, found mine already watching him, and smiled. Not the knowing smile or the deflective smile or even the new unguarded smile from the night before, but something softer, something that felt like home. We didn't talk about what we were, what this meant, what came next. We didn't need to. Some things were better lived than discussed, better felt than defined. He started keeping clothes in my dresser without asking. I started buying his coffee brand without mentioning it. Our separate apartments became technicalities. He still got his mail at 4B, but he lived in 4C, in my space that had become our space without either of us making a declaration about it. The blanket didn't disappear. If anything, it became more present, more necessary, but for different reasons now. Each time the rain started, each time evening fell, and we found ourselves on that same couch where everything had changed, Nolan would retrieve it from wherever it had ended up and drop it over our shoulders with that same quiet smile. But now the smile meant something different. Now it was acknowledgement, celebration, a small ritual that said, remember when this was all we had, remember when this was the only way we could be close. Under the blanket now, there were no more careful distances, no more hands that touched accidentally on purpose, no more silence heavy with unspoken things. Now his arm went around me automatically, pulling me against his side. Now I let my head rest on his shoulder without hesitation. Now our fingers intertwined openly on top of the blanket where anyone could see if anyone had been there to look. Sometimes during those evenings, with rain pattering against the windows and the familiar weight of wool around us, I'd think about all those weeks of careful dancing around each other. All that time we'd spent wanting what was right there in front of us, but being too afraid to reach for it. It seemed impossible now, that fear. It seemed like something from another life, another version of ourselves that we'd shed like old skin. Nolan would occasionally joke about it, about how long it took us, about how obvious we'd been to everyone but ourselves. His co-workers at the studio had apparently been placing bets on when we'd finally figure it out. My manager at the bookstore had asked, the week after that storm, what had changed, said I was carrying myself differently, lighter somehow. Even the violin-playing neighbor had commented, when we'd run into her in the hallway with Nolan's arm around my waist, that it was about time. But mostly we didn't talk about the before. We lived in the after, in this new world where I could kiss him whenever I wanted, where he could pull me close without pretense, where the careful boundaries we'd maintained for so long had dissolved entirely. The apartment felt different with him fully in it, warmer, louder, more alive. His music equipment appeared in corners, his books mixed with mine on the shelves. His presence transformed the space from mine to ours in 1,000 small ways. The storms that spring felt like gifts, each one an excuse to recreate that first night, but without the fear, without the uncertainty. We'd sit together under the blanket, watching rain streak the windows, and I'd remember that first time he dropped it over us both, how his smile had changed everything without saying a word. Now his smile said everything, and we had all the words we needed, and some nights we didn't need words at all. One evening, as another storm rolled through, Nolan pulled the blanket over us and said, soft enough that I almost missed it, that he loved me. He said it like it was just another fact, like the rain was wet, like the blanket was warm, like loving me was the most natural thing in the world. I told him I loved him too, had loved him since before I knew what to call it, since before the blanket, maybe even since that first night with the corkscrew he never actually needed. The rain outside continued to pour, would keep pouring through that whole unusually wet spring. But inside, wrapped in that same wool blanket that had started everything, held by the person who'd smiled his way into my carefully ordered life and reorganized everything for the better, I barely noticed the storm anymore. Because the warmth I had been waiting for, the warmth I hadn't even known I was missing until Nolan showed me it existed, had already found me. It had been there all along, waiting patiently under a blanket, hidden in a smile, building with each storm until it was strong enough to change everything. And it had. Everything.